The glass doors of the Halston Grand opened
Get in the
with a
car,
soft
Catherine.
hydraulic
All right,
sigh.
I am going.
Inside, everything gleamed. Black marble floors reflected chandeliers the size of small cars. Fresh white orchids sat in bronze vases.
It's a beautiful event.
Bellmen in tailored
It
coats
is, and you
moved
look
luggage
stunning.
without making a sound. A string quartet played near the mezzanine while guests in tuxedos and evening gowns crossed the lobby beneath a banner announcing the Halston Grand Winter Benefit. Outside, rain hammered the pavement, and standing just beyond the brass threshold was a man who looked like he had nowhere else to go. His name was Thomas Alden. He was 69 years old. His gray beard was uneven. His coat was old wool, darkened at the shoulders by rain. His shoes were cracked near the toes. A canvas bag hung from one hand. The doorman looked at him once, then twice. Before he could decide
evening.
what to say,
I have a
another
reservation
voice came
for
from
tonight.
behind him. Absolutely not. Mason Pryce crossed the lobby with a champagne glass in one hand
He
and
is in the private
irritation in his
lounge.
face.
Copy
At
that.
52, Mason looked like the hotel itself had dressed him. Black tuxedo, perfect white shirt, silver cufflinks, haircut every 10 days. Watch worth more than most of the housekeeping staff made in a year. He was the public owner and CEO of Pryce Luxury Hospitality, the company that operated the Halston Grand. Tonight was supposed to be his night. 200 investors, bankers, developers, politicians, and donors were inside. 3 television crews were covering the charity event. Mason had spent 6 weeks preparing every detail. He had no intention of allowing an old man in a wet coat to become part of the scenery. He looked at the doorman. Why is he still here? Thomas lifted his eyes. I was hoping to come inside for a few minutes. Mason stared at him. This is a private event. I know. Then you understand the problem. Thomas glanced through the open doors. I used to know this place. Mason smiled without warmth. I'm sure you did. He looked at Thomas's coat. From the sidewalk. A few guests nearby heard him. One man laughed. Thomas did not. Mason stepped closer. There's a shelter 4 blocks east. I'm not asking for a bed. Good, because you're not getting one. Thomas's jaw tightened slightly. I asked to come inside, and I said no. The doorman looked uncomfortable. Thomas reached into his canvas bag. Mason immediately raised one hand. Don't. Thomas stopped. Mason looked towards security. 2 guards began walking over. I have something for the front desk, Thomas said. You can mail it. It concerns the property. Mason laughed. The property? Yes. Now more people were watching. That was enough for Mason. He turned the moment into theater. Listen carefully. His voice carried beneath the chandeliers. You cannot walk into a 5-star hotel because you think you have a story about the building. Thomas said nothing. Mason pointed toward the rain. Out. Thomas held his gaze. Mason's expression sharpened. I said get out. A young concierge named Elena Ruiz stood behind the front desk. She watched Thomas closely. There was something strange about him. Not his clothes, his eyes. He looked at the lobby the way older people sometimes looked at childhood homes. Not impressed, not intimidated, familiar. Mason stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. You people always think rules are cruelty. Thomas looked at him. You people. The guards took positions on either side of Thomas. He did not resist. He only looked past Mason toward the grand staircase. His eyes stopped on a carved wooden railing near the second landing, then on the mosaic floor beneath it, then on the old brass clock above the concierge desk. For half a second, grief moved through his face. Mason missed it. Elena did not. Thomas turned toward the doors. Then a black sedan stopped outside. Another followed. 3 men and 1 woman stepped into the rain. All carried leather portfolios. The woman opened an umbrella and walked toward the entrance. Mason saw them through the glass. His face changed. He knew one of them. Daniel Roth, senior partner at Roth, Ellis and Caldwell, a real estate attorney whose clients included banks, pension funds, and family trusts worth billions. Mason straightened immediately. Daniel. The attorneys entered. Roth did not look at Mason. He looked at Thomas. Then he walked straight toward the wet old man standing between 2 security guards. Mr. Alden. The lobby froze. Thomas nodded. You're late. Roth looked at his watch. By 3 minutes. I apologize. Mason stared at them. Mr. Alden? The woman beside Roth opened her portfolio. Inside was a certified copy of a deed. a title report, a lease agreement, and a notice bearing the seal of the county clerk. Roth finally looked at Mason. "Mr. Pryce." His voice was calm. "Before your security removes anyone from this building, you may want to see who owns it." Mason's smile disappeared. The Halston Grand had not always been called the Halston Grand. 42 years earlier it was the Alden House, a faded 12-story hotel with one working elevator, leaking pipes, and a ballroom that smelled like dust. Thomas had been 27 then. His father, Arthur Alden, had purchased the property from a bankrupt railway company. Arthur had no experience in hotels. He knew construction. Thomas knew people. Together, they rebuilt it room by room. Thomas slept on the third floor during the first renovation because they could not afford private security. He carried drywall, fixed boilers, worked the front desk at night, learned the names of housekeepers, learned why guests complained about pillows but rarely about loneliness. The hotel became profitable slowly, then quickly. By the late 1990s, the Alden House was one of the most respected independent hotels in the city. Thomas married a woman named Rebecca in the ballroom. Their son, Michael, learned to walk in the lobby. Their daughter, Grace, worked summers in housekeeping because Thomas refused to let his children grow up believing hotel rooms cleaned themselves. Then Michael disappeared in a different way. He was 32 when an injury led to pain medication. The pills became something stronger. The family noticed too late. Michael moved between treatment, relapse, anger, and apologies. Thomas attacked the problem like a businessman. He found specialists, paid for private programs, made schedules, created conditions, made threats, offered money, withdrew money. He treated his son's addiction like a failing operation. Michael treated his father like a locked door. Their last conversation happened in Thomas's study. Michael looked exhausted. Thomas looked angry. "You have every resource in the world. That's the problem." "What does that mean?" "You think resources are the same as help. I have spent 2 years trying to help you. You've spent 2 years trying to manage me." Thomas stood. "I am not going to watch you destroy yourself." Michael laughed bitterly. "You don't watch anything you can't control." Then he left. 3 months later, police found him behind a bus terminal. He had been sleeping outside. Thomas identified his body at the morgue. There were no business solutions after that. Rebecca stopped playing piano. Thomas stopped sleeping. Grace stopped speaking to him for almost a year. The Alden house became unbearable. Every hallway contained Michael at a different age. 7 years old, sliding down the banister. 15, sneaking desserts from the pastry kitchen. 23, bringing friends home at midnight. 32, standing in the lobby asking his father for one more chance. Thomas sold the hotel operating company, not the building. That distinction mattered. The Alden family trust retained title to the land and the structure. The buyer acquired the brand operations, furnishings, management systems, and a long-term master lease. The transaction was common in commercial hospitality. One entity owned the real estate. Another operated the hotel. Thomas wanted distance. The trust wanted predictable income. The new operator wanted control without paying the full purchase price for the property. For years, the arrangement worked. Then Pryce Luxury Hospitality acquired the operating company. Mason Pryce became the face of the Halston Grand. He renovated the lobby, raised rates, added luxury suites, replaced the old restaurant, changed the staff uniforms. He also began referring to the hotel publicly as my property. Thomas never corrected him. Most people did not know the distinction. Mason's company controlled daily operations. Guests paid Mason. Employees worked for Mason. The signs carried Mason's brand. But the deed beneath the building still belonged to the Alden Family Property Trust. Thomas remained its controlling trustee. For almost 4 years, he never entered the hotel. Then Grace called him. Their relationship had repaired slowly after Michael's death. Grace had become an emergency physician. Unlike Thomas, she did not confuse composure with control. One evening, she called after a shift. "Dad, do you know what's happening at the hotel?" "No. There was a man outside last night." Thomas waited. A veteran, 60-something, confused. He came into the lobby because it was below freezing. "What happened?" "They removed him." "Security?" "Yes." "Was he threatening anyone?" "No." "Drunk?" "No. He just wanted to get warm." Thomas said nothing. Grace continued. One of the nurses knows someone who works there. Apparently, it happens all the time. What does? They clear anyone who looks homeless before evening guest traffic. It's a private hotel. That is exactly what you would have said 10 years ago. Thomas's face tightened. Grace's voice softened. Michael died outside, Dad. He closed his eyes. She continued. You own a building with heat in the middle of winter. We lease it. You own it. Thomas did not answer. 2 weeks later, he visited a shelter Michael had once used. He did not introduce himself as a donor. He ate dinner there, listened. One man told him the Halston Grand used to allow people into the old service vestibule during extreme weather. Thomas remembered. His father had created the practice after a man froze 2 blocks from the hotel in 1984. There had been a simple rule. When the city issued an extreme weather emergency, the side lobby remained open overnight. Coffee, chairs, no questions unless someone caused trouble. It was never advertised. It was not charity marketing. It was just something Arthur Alden believed buildings were for. Thomas checked the lease. The provision was still there. Section 18.7, Community Emergency Access Covenant. The operator was required to maintain a designated heated area during officially declared severe weather events unless prohibited by law or immediate safety conditions. Mason's company had been ignoring it. Thomas contacted Roth, Ellis, and Caldwell. At first, it looked like a simple lease compliance issue. Then the attorneys found something else. Pryce Luxury Hospitality had recently sought a major refinancing package. Mason wanted $240 million to acquire 3 additional hotels. The Halston Grand was central to the presentation. Loan materials repeatedly described Pryce Luxury as having ownership control over the property. That wording could mean several things. The lawyers kept looking. Then they found a draft collateral schedule listing the Halston Grand real estate as an asset available to secure financing. Thomas read the page twice. They cannot pledge the real estate. They don't own it, Roth said. Does the lender know? We're determining that. Does Mason? He signed the certification. That was the first real warning. The second came from property records. Mason's team had filed documents related to a planned rooftop redevelopment. The application identified Pryce Luxury Hospitality as the property owner. The deed said otherwise. It might have been administrative sloppiness. It might have been something worse. Thomas refused to assume. Investigate quietly. Roth looked at him. You're not planning to confront him? No. Why not? Thomas looked at the photograph of Michael on his desk. Because I want to know what he does when he thinks I am nobody. Roth stared at him. That sounds like a terrible idea. It probably is. You are 69. I noticed. You want to walk into a hotel looking homeless? I want to walk into my building without my name. Roth removed his glasses. Thomas, if everyone knows who I am, they'll perform. And if they don't, that is what I want to see. For the next 6 weeks, Thomas changed his routine. He stopped using his driver. He spent nights at 2 shelters, then in a church warming center, then in a cheap weekly motel. He carried cash but rarely used it. He wore the old wool coat Michael had once left in Thomas's garage. Grace hated the plan. You are turning grief into theater. No, it sounds exactly like theater. I need to see it. You need therapy. I have a therapist. You need a better one. Thomas almost smiled. Then Grace became serious. Do not pretend this makes you understand what Michael went through. That landed. Thomas nodded. I won't. Promise. I promise. He was not trying to become homeless. He was trying to become invisible. It worked. The third time, Thomas saw a young housekeeping employee named Lucia Ortega slip wrapped sandwiches into a bag near the loading dock. She handed them to 2 people waiting outside. A manager caught her. You know the rule. Lucia looked frightened. They were going in the trash. That isn't the point. Thomas listened from near the alley wall. The manager continued. Mr. Pryce doesn't want this place turning into a magnet. The sandwiches went into the dumpster. The people outside walked away. Thomas followed them. He bought dinner for both. He did not tell them who he was. That night he called Roth. Add food disposal policy to the review. Thomas, that is not a lease issue. It is now. Roth sighed. I knew you were going to say that. Then came the staff records. The trust had audit rights under the master lease for property-related obligations. Those rights opened doors. The deeper review found deferred maintenance in back-of-house areas while millions had been spent on guest-facing renovations. Fire doors were overdue for replacement. A service elevator inspection had been postponed twice. Staff housing support funds, established years earlier after a local rent crisis, had been redirected into general operations. Again, not everything was illegal. Some decisions were simply ugly, but several looked like contractual defaults. The most serious remained the financing documents. A lender had indeed been given materials that blurred the distinction between leasehold control and fee-simple ownership. Outside counsel for the trust sent quiet questions. Mason's finance team responded defensively, then stopped responding. Thomas chose the date of the winter benefit for one reason. The city had issued a severe weather warning. Temperatures were expected to fall below freezing. Under Section 18.7, the warming area had to be open. Thomas arrived at 7:41 in the rain. He wore Michael's coat. He carried a canvas bag containing one thing: a framed photograph of Arthur Alden standing beside the hotel's original front desk in 1984. He wanted to leave it with Elena Ruiz, the concierge. Elena's grandmother had worked at the Alden house for 29 years. Thomas remembered her. He had recognized the surname from staff records. That was why he asked to enter. Mason Pryce never gave him the chance. Absolutely not, the words echoed across the lobby. Thomas asked for a few minutes. Mason told him about the shelter 4 blocks east. Thomas said he was not asking for a bed. Mason said, "Good, because you're not getting one." Then came the phrase Thomas would remember. "You people always think rules are cruelty." Thomas asked, "You people?" Mason answered without hesitation, "The ones who decide everyone else owes them access." Thomas felt something old and poisonous rise inside him. Not anger at Mason, anger at himself. Because there had been a time when he would have understood the sentence. Maybe even agreed with it. Mason ordered security forward. Thomas could have ended it there. He could have said his name. He could have called Roth. He could have watched every posture in the lobby change. He did not. Mason pointed to the rain. "Out." Thomas turned. And then the lawyers arrived. Daniel Roth walked through the doors with 3 colleagues. He greeted Thomas first, not Mason. That was the moment the room changed. Mason's eyes moved to the portfolios, then to Thomas, then to Roth. "Daniel, what is this?" Roth opened his leather case. "A scheduled service of documents." "Service? Yes." Mason glanced toward the guests. "Tonight?" The timing was selected by the trust. "What trust?" Roth looked at Thomas. "The Alden Family Property Trust." Mason's face tightened. "I deal with the trust's management office." "No," Roth said. "Your legal department deals with our asset manager." He gestured toward Thomas. "This is the controlling trustee." Silence. Elena Ruiz slowly lowered the telephone behind the concierge desk. Mason stared at Thomas. "You're Thomas Alden?" "Yes. I thought—" Thomas waited. Mason stopped. "Thought what? That Thomas would arrive in a limousine? That wealth had a uniform? That ownership could not wear cracked shoes?" Roth removed a certified deed. "For clarity, Pryce Luxury Hospitality owns the operating business and holds a master lease." He placed the deed on the concierge desk. "The land and hotel structure are owned by the Alden Family Property Trust." Mason looked at the document, then at Thomas. "This is absurd," Roth continued. "The trust has issued formal notices concerning multiple alleged defaults under the lease." "Alleged? Yes. Then nothing has been established." "Correct." Thomas noticed that. Roth was precise. He always was. Mason seized on it. "Good." Roth opened a second folder. "However, one default does not require further factual investigation." He handed over a copy of Section 18.7, Community Emergency Access Covenant. Mason did not read it. His general counsel, who had just crossed the lobby, did. Her face changed. Roth continued. "The city declared a severe weather emergency at 5 p.m. He looked toward the side corridor. The designated warming area is closed." Mason turned to his operations director. "Open it." The director hesitated. "Now." The man hurried away. Thomas spoke for the first time since the attorneys arrived. "How long has it been closed?" Nobody answered. Thomas looked at Elena Ruiz. She swallowed. "More than 2 years, sir." Mason snapped toward her. "Elena." Thomas raised one hand. "Let her answer." The room became silent again. Elena looked at Thomas. I've never seen it open. Thomas nodded slowly. Mason lowered his voice. This can be fixed. Thomas looked at him. That sentence is why I came. Mason stepped closer. Mr. Alden, I clearly didn't recognize you. No. If I had… Thomas waited. Mason stopped again. There it was. The entire problem in 6 unfinished words. If I had recognized you. Thomas looked around the lobby. Housekeepers stood near the service corridor. Bellmen near the doors. Guests pretending not to listen. Security guards who had been ordered to remove him. You should finish that sentence. Mason's jaw tightened. This is not the place. It was the place when you thought I was homeless. No one moved. Thomas continued. You had no problem making it public then. Mason's face reddened. You came into a private event dressed like this deliberately. Yes. You set me up. No. Thomas shook his head. I gave you an opportunity to treat a stranger with basic dignity. He glanced toward the doors. You made your own decision. Mason looked at Roth. Are we done? Roth opened a third folder. No. That was when the financial problem arrived. The trust had obtained copies of the refinancing collateral package through a title diligence request. Roth placed one schedule on the desk. Mason's general counsel read it. Her face drained. This is a draft. Yes. It was never executed. We know. Then why are we discussing it? Because it identifies real estate your company does not own as proposed collateral. Mason answered quickly. It refers to leasehold interest. Roth pointed to the language. No. Elsewhere, leasehold interests are described separately. Mason looked at his CFO across the lobby. The CFO looked down. Thomas noticed. What else? Thomas asked. Roth gave him a look. They had agreed to discuss this upstairs. Thomas had changed his mind. Roth continued. The redevelopment application signed by Mr. Pryce identifies Pryce Luxury Hospitality as property owner. Administrative mistake, Mason said. Possibly. Roth nodded. And the lender certification? Mason said nothing. One of the bankers attending the benefit stepped forward. Her name was Evelyn Hart. She represented the institution leading Mason's refinancing. What certification? Mason's face changed. He had not realized she was close enough to hear. Roth looked at Thomas before answering. Thomas nodded. Roth handed her a copy. Evelyn read it, slowly. The lobby felt smaller with every second. She looked at Mason. You represented that all material property interests listed in Schedule B were controlled without third-party title restrictions. We control the property under lease. That is not the same thing. Our lawyers reviewed it. Mason's general counsel spoke immediately. We did not review this version. Everyone looked at her. Mason's head turned. Claire. She met his eyes. I have never seen this schedule. That was the moment the gala stopped being a social embarrassment. It became a governance crisis. The board of Pryce Luxury Hospitality met in a private dining room 40 minutes later. The winter benefit continued downstairs because no one knew how else to end it. Thomas attended the meeting with Roth. So did Mason. So did the company's general counsel, CFO, 2 independent directors, and representatives from the refinancing bank. The documents were spread across a long walnut table. Mason began with the same argument. This was retaliation. Thomas had disguised himself. The trust was using a minor hospitality incident to interfere with financing. Thomas let him speak. Then Roth began listing the defaults. Failure to maintain the emergency access covenant. Failure to preserve designated community use areas. Unapproved changes to protected architectural elements. Delayed life safety maintenance. Redirection of restricted property support funds. Potential misrepresentation of ownership interests in third-party documents. Mason attacked each one. Some he could explain, some he could not. The board asked the CFO why the collateral schedule described the Halston Grand the way it did. The CFO said he had raised concerns. With whom? An independent director asked. The CFO looked at Mason. The room went quiet. Mason leaned forward. Be careful. Thomas looked at him. The CFO swallowed. I raised it with Mason. When? 6 weeks ago. Response? The CFO opened his laptop. I have the email. He projected it onto the screen. The message was short. Don't complicate ownership language. We control the asset economically. The lenders understand the structure. Mason stared at the screen. It says economically. The banker answered. It also says don't complicate ownership language. That is not fraud. No one said it was. Roth's voice remained calm. We said it requires investigation. Thomas watched Mason. For the first time that evening, the CEO looked less angry than afraid. The board voted to pause the refinancing. Then it placed Mason on administrative leave pending an independent review. Mason laughed. You can't be serious. The lead independent director looked at him. We are completely serious. This company is mine. Thomas thought of the deed downstairs. There it was again. Mine. The building, the employees, the company, the room. Mason seemed to believe ownership was a feeling produced by enough obedience. The director answered, You are CEO. Mason stared at him. For now. The investigation lasted 5 months. The title issue was only part of it. Once independent counsel began reviewing governance, other things surfaced. Executive expenses charged to hotel redevelopment budgets. Vendor contracts awarded to a company partially owned by a longtime Pryce associate. Maintenance reserves moved to support expansion planning. Emails pressuring staff to clear undesirable visual elements from guest entrances. That phrase appeared repeatedly. Undesirable visual elements. People. They meant people. Unhoused people. Street vendors. Teenagers waiting too long near the entrance. Anyone who interfered with the image Mason wanted guests to buy. The warming area had been closed not because of safety, because Mason believed its existence harmed the luxury brand. Lucia Ortega, the housekeeping employee Thomas had seen with the sandwiches, testified that managers had been told not to distribute leftover food near the property because it encouraged people to return. The policy was not illegal. It was simply revealing. The trust issued a formal cure notice. Pryce Luxury Hospitality had 30 days to restore multiple lease obligations. The board complied. The side warming area reopened. New doors, clean chairs, coffee, water, security rules based on behavior, not appearance. A local nonprofit agreed to staff it during weather emergencies. Thomas refused to put his name on the program. He named it Arthur's Room, after his father. Mason never returned as CEO. The board terminated him for cause after the independent review found repeated governance failures, undisclosed conflicts, and material misstatements in financing preparation. Whether every issue would support a legal claim was left to attorneys and regulators. The company did not wait to find out. His unvested compensation was canceled under the terms of his contract. 2 outside board seats disappeared within weeks. The refinancing bank withdrew its package. A planned acquisition collapsed. Several investors demanded new governance controls before providing future capital. Mason filed a claim challenging his termination. Months later, it settled confidentially. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic courtroom speech, no crowd outside cheering. Real power usually leaves quietly. Access cards stop working. Assistants stop answering. Invitations stop coming. People who once laughed too loudly at your jokes suddenly become difficult to reach. Thomas watched none of it with pleasure. That surprised Grace. You got what you wanted, she said. They were sitting in Arthur's room one evening while freezing rain hit the windows. What did I want? Mason gone. Thomas looked around. 8 people sat drinking coffee. A woman charged her phone near the wall. An older man slept upright in a chair. Lucia Ortega had been promoted to Community Operations Coordinator and was speaking with a shelter volunteer. I wanted the door open. Grace looked at him. That's not all you wanted. Thomas knew she was right. He looked down at Michael's old coat folded beside him. I wanted to know whether I would have thrown myself out. Grace did not answer. Thomas continued. 20 years ago. She looked at him. I might have. Maybe. I thought rules were neutral. They're not. I thought if I treated everyone the same, I was fair. Grace nodded slowly. And? Thomas looked toward the lobby beyond the glass partition. People do not arrive with the same amount of power. Grace smiled faintly. That sounds almost wise. Don't spread it around. A year later, the Halston Grand was still a luxury hotel. Rooms still cost too much. Champagne still appeared at charity dinners. Guests still complained about pillows. Thomas had not turned it into a shelter. That was never the point. He had turned one room back into what his father intended. A place where weather did not get to decide whether someone was treated like a human being. 3 years after the winter benefit, Thomas still owned the building. but he rarely entered through the executive entrance. He preferred the front. Sometimes the doorman recognized him. Sometimes a new employee did not. Thomas liked both versions. One freezing night, he arrived just after midnight. He wore a good coat this time. Arthur's room was open. A security officer stood near the entrance. Thomas watched a man in worn clothes approach the lobby doors. The officer stepped forward. For 1 second, Thomas felt the old fear. Then the officer opened the door. "Cold out there?" The man nodded. "Come inside." No lecture, no suspicion, no performance, just a door opening. Thomas stood across the street in the snow and watched. He thought about Michael, about the bus terminal, about every argument in which Thomas had tried to solve his son instead of hearing him. He could not change that ending. Money could not purchase a different past. A deed could establish ownership of land. It could not establish ownership of time. But maybe buildings could carry memory differently. Maybe power could be used after regret instead of before it. Thomas crossed the street. The security officer recognized him and straightened. Thomas shook his head. "Don't." The officer relaxed. Thomas looked toward Arthur's room. "Everything okay?" "Yes, sir." Thomas smiled faintly. "Good." Then he walked through the lobby. The same black marble, the same chandeliers, the same staircase, the same brass clock, but not the same place. Mason Pryce had believed the most important fact in that lobby was who owned the hotel. He was wrong. The deed mattered because it gave Thomas legal power. The lawyers mattered because they could enforce it. The trust mattered because it could remove an operator who ignored its obligations. But none of those things were the real reversal. The real reversal happened before the lawyers entered. It happened when Mason looked at a man in a wet coat and decided that man's dignity depended on whether he had a reservation. Everything after that was paperwork. Thomas Alden had spent most of his life believing ownership meant control. His son taught him too late that control could not save everyone. Mason taught him something else. Power did not reveal character when people knew you had it. Power revealed character when they thought you had none. And that was why Mason's downfall began with an old man standing quietly in the rain. A man Mason believed had no room, no money, no influence, no right to cross the threshold. A man he ordered out of the building, without realizing the building was the one thing in the room that actually belonged to him.